OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper that came out of a conversation I had with Lorenzo on conspiracies. You can find the OG Rose conversation on the website. Lorenzo does very fascinating work on conspiracies. One of the things he's trying to do is to sort of make people, if they believe in something like a QAnon or flat Earth, he tries to offer them skin in the game. He says, okay, well, if you believe in the flat Earth, bet X amount of money. And why would you not do that? Because there's an asymmetrical game. There's so many people who are going to bet against you that if, you take that bet and you win, you're going to make so much money. So the idea is to have people who are in conspiracies put skin in the game to make them face to find out if they're really serious about it, because there's this problem today where it does not seem like rationality alone is up to the task of defeating conspiracies. In fact, as we try to argue throughout The Truism, the Rational, the dream of what's called autonomous rationality, to allude to David Hume, which is in some respects the dream of the Enlightenment, the idea that if you found a perfectly coherent worldview, there's only one of those, and what that worldview was would correspond with reality. So coherence of a worldview or truth, which would say that it's logical, it doesn't entail any internal contradictions or essential problems. Coherence would correspond with correspondence. It would go with reality. The fact that it was coherent would be evidence that it has something to do with the real world. So, with the Enlightenment, the idea is if we could get rid of falsity, if we could get rid of religion, superstition, and so on and so forth, then rationality would be free to make itself coherent, and as a result, we would get a complete model of reality, and we would be good to go. Well, it turns out that rationality is more simply in the business of coherence, and it doesn't really care if its worldview or its system of thought that entails no contradiction corresponds with reality. And what's happened is actually now it's as if rationality, with the death of God, if we just use that Nietzsche line as a reference point, the death of God has marked the unleashing of rationality to find as many systems, internally consistent systems as possible, and to release them upon the earth. And there seems to be hundreds of them, or at least lots of them, or at least new ones can come up every single day. And I talked about this with Samuel Barnes in our conversation on The Truth Organizes Values, which is the opening paper of The Conflict of Mind. Charles Taylor, in his book The Secular Age, which Belonging again gets into a lot, talked about the Nova effect and kind of the idea that secularism, which we thought would correspond with a decline of religion, has actually corresponded with an explosion, a multiplication of religion, and he calls this the Nova effect. Well, it's almost actually what has happened is that secularism has caused an explosion of internally consistent systems, and that would include conspiracies like QAnon. Because if you think about it, do you really, how would you disprove QAnon? Relative to the premises and axioms that it accepts, it's coherent. There's nothing in it that would necessarily unveil it as false. You'd have to enter into QAnon to find out for yourself. But once you do that, the very coherence of the system of thought will filter our experience in such a way that will seem to confirm QAnon. So it becomes very difficult to escape once you enter into it. And there's lots of documentaries and books and so on and so forth on cults, and cults are a similar problem. They are internally consistent, and once you enter into them, they filter your experience to confirm them. And religions are internally coherent system, and it's really important. You see, the issue is just because the fact that a system is internally coherent is in fact reason to think that it is true. That's part of the problem, and yet it's very possible for something to be coherent and not true. But you also can't say for sure that it's not true without investigating it. So that poses quite a lot of problems, because again, if it filters your experience to explore the internally consistent system, but you can't disprove it without entering it, well, you see how it's a self-fulfilling prophecy then. That's quite problematic. And it's almost as if God, the concept of God, kind of kept a Pandora's box closed that had rationality inside of it, and God was able to kind of bind rationality, because if you believed in a supernatural agent, then you always had to understand that rationality couldn't go all the way, that there was always mysteries it couldn't fully understand, and furthermore, those mysteries were conscious, and they could demand things of us, and they could affect the nature of reality. But now, if you don't believe in God, then all there is rationality, and it's like Pandora's box has been opened, and it's been unleashed, and it's just creating constant constant coherent systems. It's unleashed all these religions and belief systems and cults and internally consistent systems upon the world. Now, that's not to say that religion in its own right hasn't contributed to conspiracies, but if Charles Taylor is correct, it's almost like it was more bound, and but now rationality has been unleashed upon the world. And you see, it's impossible, though, not to have a worldview. And if you're going to have a worldview, you're going to have one that you try to make coherent. You're going to do everything in your power to avoid contradictions within it. But of course, if someone comes along and says to you, hey, your neighbor's engaged in in sex trafficking or something like that, because you'll notice Lorenzo brings up this point that so many conspiracies involve sex trafficking because it's such a terrible thing, especially involving children. And what kind of monster would you be in order not to go next door and just make sure that your neighbor is not involved in sex trafficking? Because why would this person come to your house and say that your neighbor was doing that unless there's something to it? And since you want to be intellectually responsible, since you don't want to be someone who would not look after children or do what's morally right, you're kind of compelled to go over and look. And furthermore, if you don't look, there's something intellectually irresponsible about that, which would then open a rupture in your worldview, of which you want to have reason to think that your worldview is a product of epistemic responsibility. But if in that instant you don't act upon information, well, then that's going to kind of threaten your entire worldview and your entire view of self. But you see, here's the problem. Once you go next door to see if they're involved in sex trafficking, how are you going to find out? You'd have to go into the house, you'd have to go into the basement, all of which then your neighbor would be wondering what in the world you're doing, and then they would ask you, and then they might get upset, but then the fact that they're upset would perhaps function as evidence that they are in fact trying to hide something, and then you tell them while you're here, somebody told you they were involved in sex trafficking, and now your neighbor is like, I can't believe you'd even think that about me, and so your relationship with your neighbor completely collapses, and now you don't like your neighbor. Well, frick, if you don't like your neighbor, then it's easier to think that they're involved in something like sex trafficking, and you see how it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. As mentioned in the talk, it's almost as if today all we need is an Iago, some sort of the Shakespeare play Othello. Iago was able to convince Othello that the woman that he loved was sleeping around and betraying him simply because Iago was always able to maintain an internally consistent and plausible system of thought that made it the case that Othello couldn't know for sure that his loved one was not cheating on him. And then, of course, Iago was able to find the handkerchief. Well, it's almost like today when we're all online, maybe there's 1,000 Iagos in the world, but that's all it takes to manipulate millions of people in a problematic direction. And worse yet, a lot of the Iagos online believe in the conspiracy themselves. In order for rationality, to get back to the topic of rationality, in order for rationality to be bound, the paper talks about the 3 C's: conformity, correspondence, and coherence. So rationality is always, as we've established, trying to be coherent. It's trying not to have any contradictions. It's always trying to correspond with reality. And then it also wants to conform with that reality. But since reality might always be bigger than what rationality can learn, there can sometimes be a distinction between correspondence and conformity. But rationality is always trying to conform. But you see, when God died, when we decided that truth was unknowable, or realized, not decided it was unknowable, realized truth was ultimately unknowable, say with a Kurt Gödel, well, now rationality can't correspond or conform. All it can do is cohere, be internally consistent. But if it's not corresponding, then it certainly can't conform with anything, and thus it's unleashed. And so then all it's doing is confirmation bias. Then all it's doing is putting itself in situations where it's almost an Iago to itself. It falls into a QAnon. It falls into thinking that the government is out to kill us all, or hiding aliens, or the Republicans are secretly fascist, or something like that. We can play this game all day. And then what all rationality can do is, once it's accepted that premise, is maintain its coherence and defend it and stick to it. But the premise, since we can never ultimately determine if it corresponds with reality, the premise never has to be defeated. And so this is a massive problem. Once somebody clings to the premises of a conspiracy, they never have to leave it. They never have to give it up. The map is indestructible is the phrase that the third book in the trilogy trilogy uses. And this is also why I find Lorenzo's program so useful, because you're trying to you're using skin in the game to get people to find out if they really are serious about their own conspiracy, as opposed to trying to unveil to them that they're stupid. Because you see, when you're just trying to unveil to people that they're stupid, well, their rationality can always find a way to where they're not stupid, and also the very fact that you called them stupid means you're part of the conspiracy. So that method just simply does not work. So we have now, the other thing that's happened with conspiracies is, say, before the internet, one can think of the Douglas movie The Game, or the Pynchon novels, where it's one person believes in a global conspiracy and they alone are in the town to discover that conspiracy. Well, now you can join up with groups. Now you can find lots of people that believe the conspiracy. So let's say that 0.1% of Americans believe in QAnon. Well, that's, somewhere around 300,000 people. And where in the past, those 300,000 people would have been scattered across the country and probably would have never met. Now they can find each other online, and it's actually likely that they find each other online. So now you have this unique phenomenon of groups, like large groups, assenting to a conspiracy. And then if we refer back to Eric Job's discussion on group psychology, which we did that work on Freud, QAnon, and Hannah Arendt about. In groups, we feel like we're in dreams. In dreams, we're allowed to let our wishes, our releases, the things that hold us back go down. There's a lot of wish fulfillment and so on and so forth. I encourage you to listen to the talk. And then if it's indeed the case that the dream is associated with the movie, that group psychology, dream psychology, and movie psychology all go together, well, now we have that unique psychological conditioning combined with conspiracies. So, which is unique, I think, for this day. And that's extremely problematic, because a conspiracy, it's indestructible. It's very hard to defeat. And the paper also talks about something called standalone complexes based on Ghost in the Shell, which is the idea that it's an organization that has no original leadership. A traditional organization you could basically defeat by destroying the center, and everything would fall apart. Well, now there is no center. So in order to make a standalone complex go away, you have to basically erase it all at once or all together, and that's practically impossible, so it can always reconstitute itself. So today you have conspiracies are now followed not by lone individuals, but by groups of people who are, because they are supported by a group, feel supercharged and super justified and not alone in pursuing that conspiracy. And also, if indeed they feel like they're in a movie, they feel like they can do anything. And also their dream psychology is being fulfilled. So there's a primal instinct that's being fulfilled. So they're really going to cling to that conspiracy, because the conspiracy finally lets them release things that they've been repressing. Well, you put that all together with a standalone complex, which is very, very difficult to defeat. Well, you've got a massive problem, a huge problem. And then, of course, the question is, well, how do you defeat it? Do you defeat it with totalitarianism or something like that? Well, that doesn't seem like a solution. Doesn't seem like a solution at all. I think also what you see, the conversation talks about, we talk about the collective consciousness of the internet, and how we're all going, the singularity, we're going to be super smart and stuff like that. Well, if indeed it's rationality that is creating this nova effect of conspiracies, then the singularity may simply be an instance where rationality is even better at creating more conspiratorial situations or internally consistent systems that we get lost in. And we talked about before with Lorenzo on neurodivergence, on the idea of someone like John Nash, the great mathematician. He came up with game theory, Nash equilibrium, and things like that. And a lot of times we think that his schizophrenia or his mental illness was kind of a distraction from his genius. But the biography about Mr. Nash makes the point that a lot of times the schizophrenia was a heightening, not a diminishing of consciousness. It wasn't an alienation from reasoning, but a alienation from everything else but rationality. And so the point is that, and John Nash himself would say that his mental divergence was the source, his schizophrenia was a source of his brilliant insight. Well, if that's the case, then it's very possible that the internet is just making us a collective John Nash, which means, yes, we're super smart, but we're also super prone to schizophrenia or a mental illness like that. But if, in fact, the collective consciousness is becoming something like John Nash, then what we're going to see is just further and further explosions and multiplications of these internally consistent systems that people get lost in because they have to take a pitch and risk in order to prove that they're false, which means they'll get sucked into, and once they get sucked into, it's very difficult to get out. All of that will simultaneously be occurring as the singularity is super brilliant. And precisely because the singularity of the internet is super brilliant, it may see all the more reason to take out, to remove, to censor, to strongman the people that fall into the conspiracies. But you see, as Lorenzo points out, we're all just one day away, one moment away from falling into a conspiracy ourselves, precisely because it is genius that contributes to people. It is rationality that contributes to people falling into conspiracy thinking. So all of us can fall into that at any moment. And so if we do indeed get into a world where there's just a massive split between people falling into the people that go into conspiratorial thinking and the people that go into brilliance, which will be part of the same singularity, because the virtues of that singularity, the power of that singularity, the good of that singularity will be the virtues of which are also the source of the conspiratorial thinking. The vices of the singularity won't be the sources of the conspiratorial thinking, but the virtues. And so you can't get rid of you can't get rid of the bad without getting rid of the good, and that may lead to something the singularity may ultimately prove to be very pathological. So this is a real challenge. This is a real dilemma that we are going to have to figure out. The paper also talks about the work of Dr. Zach Stein, whose work on mass information warfare I think is also extremely relevant. But I encourage you on the Jim Rutt show. I believe he has an extraordinary discussion, and I encourage you to go listen to that. So anyway, this has been OG Rose, and in conversation with Lorenzo. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.